Пані та панове, шановні глядачі, мене звати Данило Лубківський, і я радий вітати вас від імені Київського безпекового форуму. У нас сьогодні особлива тема і особливі гості. Ситуація в Росії. Чи можливі демократичні зміни в Росії? Яка перспектива російських громадянських протестів? Зрештою, що робити з Росією? Ці теми ми сьогодні обговоримо із спеціальними гостями нашого форуму. І я хотів би зараз їх представити. It is my great privilege to introduce today our distinguished speakers and panelists. First of all, Garry Kasparov, a famous Russian pro-democracy leader, global human rights activist, author, and the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation. He is a former world chess champion. I thank you, Mr. Kasparov, for being with us today. Ambassador Michael McFaul, a well-known American diplomat and leading global expert on Russia and the United States foreign policy. Ambassador McFaul is the former US ambassador to Russia, and currently he is a professor of political science at Stanford University and the director of Freeman-Spoley Institute for International Studies. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us. Mrs. Viola von Cramon-Taubadel, a well-known German politician, the member of the European Parliament. Mrs. von Cramon is the member of the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs and the member of the newly established Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union. She is also the vice chair of the European Parliament's delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee. I thank you, Viola, for being with us. And Mr. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, former Ukraine's Prime Minister in 2014 and 16 and the chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum. Thank you all for joining this discussion. Before we start, on behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum, I wish to express our solidarity with those in Russia who struggle for human rights, liberty, and dignity against President Putin's regime. I also pay tribute to the efforts of Mr. Kasparov. Among the Russian opposition leaders, he belongs to those who have the strength to stand up against not only President Putin, but the very nature, basics, fundamentals of his politics. Mr. Kasparov, my first question goes to you. Putin's Russia is the international aggressor. It violates the international law. It has occupied Ukraine's Crimea and part of Donbass. It continues to threaten its neighbors and interferes in the domestic affairs of the West. But the fundamental reasons of its aggression, in my opinion, go far beyond the personal preferences and traumas of President Putin. There is something bigger behind. Russia remains a country with around 39 million pensioners and 18 million war veterans and recipients of state benefits. So apparently this is the ideological core of popular moods in Russia. So these people order the music. And the majority of them, no surprise, cherish the Soviet legacy, believe in Russia's supremacy, do not trust the West, and do not understand why they really need liberal democracy. On the other hand, as the Financial Times recently described it, a generation of Russians, just listen, around 40 million people have been born or spent their entire education in a political system that revolves around one man. Putin's generations, Putin's armies. So I start from the most important question. Mr. Kasparov, do you really believe that Russia can change? And if yes, please explain why. You're welcome.
It's an existential question that requires more than 4 or 5 minutes. Yeah, I can come up with arguments pro and cons. The answer is yes, Russia can and must change to survive. Empires, they're doomed, and I don't see any future for Russian state if it doesn't change rather sooner than later. But the changes cannot happen within this Putin system. And by the way, I always oppose calling him President Putin. He's a dictator. Russia today is a one-man dictatorship, openly embraces all elements of fascist ideology, both domestically and internationally. And overall, it's a mafia structure because loyalty is the only criteria of your political success inside Russia. And the future, immediate future, depends very much on the ability of the outside world, the free world, to recognize that Putin is in hybrid war against the free world. And he's doing so not because he believes in Russian imperialism. I don't think he cares so much about Russian borders. He cares only about money and power, or power money. You know, just depends what angle of observation you prefer. And he feels that by promoting this aggressive agenda, he can prolong his power because he has nothing else to offer to Russian people. Its economy is in terrible shape. Things are getting worse. Now they have to regulate prices. They're talking about food certificates. So it's this, and on other end of the equation, you have billionaires. But these billionaires are not keeping their money in Russia or in China or Venezuela or Iran. They keep their money in the free world. So to sum up my opening remarks, I would say that the future of Russia and the ability of Russia to transform very much will depend on the resolution of the free world to oppose Putin aggression. We knew from the Soviet history that the regimes like Putin's one, they are very vulnerable to geopolitical defeats. And so far, Putin is quite confident that neither Europe nor America are ready to deliver any blow that could galvanize protests in Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Kasparov. But if we speak about the instruments, some practical steps, how would you assess the current ongoing civil protests in Russia? And how can those protests influence the Kremlin? Can the Kremlin behave more aggressively, externally and internally? What do you think?
From the latest response from Kremlin to these protests, we all understand they burned all the bridges. They're not looking for any compromise. The brute force is the last resort. Yes, Putin always, relied on brute force. He has no allergy for blood. We know it from the early days, his early days in power. Whether it was explosion on Russian territory, this is mysterious explosions of Russian apartment blocks, Chechen War, Nordos, Beslan, and of course, war crimes committed by Russian war experts in Syria. And yes, I'm not even mentioning Ukraine. Just I know how painful is that. So, but he always tried to look for some sort of legal cover-up. And what we saw in the last few months, that they threw away. There's no more, it's not just a game anymore. So they threw away all the legal arguments, and they just demonstrated that the brute force will be the only element to control the situation in the country. But at the same time, it was a first protest that involved Russians across the country. Yes, numbers were not critical yet, but from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, we saw people, making to the streets against government's warnings, knowing that they would be facing arrests, beating, and God knows, something worse. But they're still there. The protest is not dead. And all numbers, official numbers, coming from Kremlin and Kremlin polls, demonstrate that the Putin's approval rating is going down. People are really upset, and 70% or more of those who protested recently, they are 35 years old or younger. That means these people, they just they have no connections to the Soviet Union, to the Soviet history, and they demonstrated that they are flatly rejecting Putin's regime. I think this is a kind of a challenge that regime cannot survive if simultaneously it will have to fight geopolitical conflicts, meeting not West that is looking for so-called dialogue, but the free world that is willing to fight back.
Good. Our principal question is whether Russia is able to transform itself peacefully into a democratic state. For Ukraine, this is important. This is a vital question for us. And I invite Ambassador McFaul to share his vision. Excellency, in your latest article in Foreign Affairs, you argue that one should not be mistaken. Russia is not a declining power, you say. You also stress that in addition to power, President Putin has purpose. That's important. So it means that Putin's Russia is a threat, remains and will be. No reset. It simply won't work. How do you assess the current developments in Russia? What realistic perspectives do you anticipate, and how to contain Putin? You're welcome.
Well, first, thanks for having me. Great discussion so far. And thank you for citing the article in Foreign Affairs. And third, I need to always say, I have a lot of new friends that are in the US government. Some of them are very close, long friends I've known for decades, but I'm speaking here just on my personal capacity. And I want to start by speaking as a professor and to echo something that Gary already started with. You know, in academia in the United States, for those that study Russia, and not just Russia, by the way, this is a big debate in academia here at Stanford. We have many people that wrestle with these issues. There is this debate about countries, whether they're driven by culture and history, or whether individuals matter and institutions matter. And there's a big debate, especially about whether countries can become democratic or not. You all just started the conversation with that. And I want to make sure you understand that I come down firmly on the side that countries, of course, history matters, of course, culture matters, but history and culture do not determine the futures of countries. Because if they determine the futures of countries, then all of Europe would still be ruled by kings and Russia would be ruled by czar, and so would Ukraine, right? And same with our friends in Japan. So it's not determinative. And I come down that institutions matter and individuals matter in that debate, and that leaves open the possibility of change. I want to remind your listeners that there are many American scholars that disagree with that view radically. And just to point out that that is the central debate in academia in the United States about the future of Russia. But if you take my point of view, then there are two things that I added in that foreign affairs piece that I think gets undervalued in the debate here in the United States. First, about power. It's very conventional wisdom, and even today, to say that Russia has no power, it's just a gas station pretending to be a country. Senator McCain famously said that many years ago, and people still echo that in the debate about Russia. And I wanted to point out in the article that actually that's a mistake. If we think that Russia's just withering away in a declining power, and therefore we should just focus on China, that's the big debate here in the United States, because Russia doesn't matter. I think that's a mistake. And I point out in the article the kinds of power, very coercive instruments of power that Russia has to do damage to the liberal democratic world. And when I say liberal democratic world, I include Ukraine in that. And number two, I think we underestimate the ideology that Mr. Putin embraces. Again, it's very fashionable in my country here in the United States to say, oh, Putin, he's transactional. I heard that many, many times when I was in the government. It still happens. Oh, he's just transactional. He just wants to do deals. And I think that underestimates his ideology, his nationalism, orthodox imperial ideas that he has, that he invests lots of money in to try to propagate those ideas through media, social media, but also very coercive ways, as we learned in my country, especially in 2016. And I don't need to tell Ukrainians about how they do that, where they grotesquely violate sovereignty in your country more so than any other country. But there are multiple methods that he uses to propagate those sets of ideas. And therefore, you're not going to be able to contain Putin's Russia if you don't focus on power and ideas. This is an ideological struggle buoyed by real power. And I think as a starting point for containment, those are two facts that one needs to recognize. And I just want to point out that it's a big debate in my country about whether or not Russia should be considered, one, as a power, and two, as an ideological power. And let me always be clear, Putin's Russia, not Russia, Putin.
Thank you, Ambassador McFaul. Actually, in your article, you say that that's important. Putinism is winning over converts mainly in Europe, but also in the United States and elsewhere. So, in your opinion, why the West is such an easy target for Putin?
Well, just as I never allow my students, I never allow, when I'm on TV in the United States, people say Russia this, Russia, Russia, Russia. And I always say Putin, Putin, Putin. And I want to remind people that there are many kinds of Russians. Gary Kasparov is a Russian. Mr. Navalny is Russian. Lots of Russians have many different views. And Gary very eloquently, I think, reminded your listeners that that is true even in Putin's Russia. And I would say the same about the West. There's no longer a monolithic West that thinks all together. Most certainly in Europe, you have different views, and I'm not going to, with other I'm the only non-European here, so I'll let you all Europeans talk about European views. But from a distance here in California, it does not appear that all Europeans think the same way. And I want to be clear here, I'm not interested in the debate between conservatives and social democrats in my country, between Democrats and Republicans. That's not interesting. Those are policy debates that countries should have internally. What should the tax rate be? Whether we should, what's our new law on immigration? We're going to debate that among ourselves. And we don't need you all to help us on that debate. But there's another fundamental debate between Democrats and autocrats, or liberals and illiberals. And that debate is not a national debate. That is a debate that is happening within countries in Europe and within my country. We saw it very tragically on January 6th in my country. And that was not a fight. When those people stormed the Capitol, those are illiberal people. Those are anti-democratic people that don't believe in the basic rules of the game of liberal democracies. And that is what Putin is about. And those forces in your country as well, by the way, you have them in Ukraine. And I think they are in different parts of Europe, have deeper support versus not. But that is the illiberal international that Putin is trying to stitch together. He believes that he has allies, ideological allies in Germany, in Italy, in France, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States of America. And in his view, that is the fight against liberalism that is part of this ideological struggle. So it's not between countries, and it's not between Russia and the West. It's between what I call autocrats and Democrats, or liberals and illiberals.
I thank you. And now I invite to turn to the European perspective, and I invite Viola von Cramon to join our discussion. Let's face the facts. Moscow has no intention to meet the demands of the West, the European Union, and international law. This is the fact. The recent visit to Moscow of Mr. Josep Borrell, the Vice President of the European Commission and the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and his attempts to convince the Kremlin ended up, in my opinion, as a clear failure, disappointment. They do not listen. Mr. Navalny remains imprisoned. The Russian authorities refuse to permit public gatherings to commemorate Boris Nemtsov. And we should expect new crackdowns on the protesters. Russia escalates the war against Ukraine. It abuses the rights of the Crimean Tatars and our Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories. It further interferes into the political affairs of our nations. The recent intelligence reports indicate that the Kremlin expands its military presence on the western borders. Don't you think, Viola, that President Putin decided to raise up the strategic tensions and to put the blame on the West? What should be the European reaction, in your opinion? You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Danylo, Arseniy, Yatsenyuk, and all the others for having me and giving me a chance to contribute to this very important debate. I mean, the visit of Josep Borrell was very painful for all of us. I cannot say how much we all suffered and what was the outcome. I mean, as you said, it was not only a failure, it was a disaster. It was a PR disaster for all of us. If you want to meet with Sergei Lavrov, you better make sure you're well prepared. And not only this. I mean, if you go into a press conference and you are attacked in a way, you either stop this or you go back and talk to him, well, that's not the way how we're going to proceed. But just taking the questions, being polite, jumping on nonsense, such as palm trees in Cuba and all this extremely nonsense. I mean, none of us in the European Union could ever understand what is the strategy, what was the strategy of this visit. If you really want to have a reset, you need an agenda and you have conditions. And you have mentioned some of the, let's say, conflict areas of the Kremlin for the last years. But the list is much longer, and we all know this. I mean, it started with Georgia. We have the Moldovan thing, which was never being settled, was never in the interest of the Kremlin to settle this. We have the continuously brutal support for Assad. We have more than 6.5 million of IDPs and refugees, mainly in the European Union and in the neighboring countries. And we do not see that there's any compromise going on in, let's say, a transformative power in Syria, not at all. So the cynicism of the regime of Putin and his big boys, or his close allies is very obvious. And you have probably read the book of Karen de Visscher, who owns Russia. And I was surprised to see that so far there's no German translation. And I was thinking of actually, we need a bigger initiative that we translate, organize a crowdfunding, a translation, not just to German, but to all European languages, and try to make sure what kind of so-called partner is this regime like. It's as Garry Kasparov has said. I mean, this is a mafia state, and it's built on loyal relationship. It's not built on cooperation. It's not built on reasonable behavior. It's not built on something what we have our, let's say, social contract in the West built on. And that makes it very difficult if you have naive diplomats coming from the West, going to Moscow and just think this is any kind of a partner you can deal with. No, it's not. It's completely different. And so I see that we are not well prepared. We, especially in Germany, have a very strange, let's say, historic a close relation towards Russia. I mean, Timothy Snyder has written all about the Bloodland region, and we know that if we have a historic responsibility, then it would be first Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states, and of course it would be Russia, but it would be the Soviet Union and especially the states in between, rather than Russia itself. So all these historic facts, plus the long list of conflicts, which sometimes get forgotten, Georgia, Moldova, Syria, plus, of course, Ukraine, plus the hybrid war, what Ambassador has said with the ideology. I mean, it's very easy for Putin to have an anchor in Orban's Hungary regime. Orban is now fighting for his NGO law, which is very similar to what Russia has put in place, I think, 10 years ago already. So we see a lot of instruments where Putin is very successfully working on either his former neighbor or his neighbors and the members of the European Union. So you ask what should be the reply or the response of the West. I think better prepared, a clear rhetoric, and a clear set of an agenda how to deal with this kind of a regime.
Thank you, Viola, for this clarity and for this unambiguity. You reminded me, you just mentioned the historical debate, and you reminded me of this unfortunate and I would say notorious remark done by the president of Germany, Steinmeier, who talked about the Nord Stream 2 and said that it's one of the few bridges between Russia and Europe. He said, for us Germans, there is another dimension. We must not lose sight of the bigger picture, meaning the more than 20 million Soviet people killed in the Second World War. It's a notorious remark. It simply excludes the Ukrainian enormous victims and losses, likewise the losses of Belarus and other nations. So what do you think about the Nord Stream 2 issue? What about the internal domestic debate in Germany on this?
Well, I think there are different strategies. First of all, we had a problem with the former chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who mainly interfered in the federal, the federal issues, while we, and especially the chancellor herself, had to deal with refugees, mainly also caused by Russia. Well, this is a coincidence. So on one hand, we have seen it was in the hand of a social democratic ministry, and she had to decide whether she get involved into this and takes it in her house, in the chancellor, or she left it to the ministry, and she decided she would leave it as an economical project, which is of course not the case. I see there is, let's say, growing resistance. Of course, in my party, we were the only and the first ones objecting this project because of Ukraine, because we saw the geostrategic approach, because we saw the path dependency, because we know if it's once built, it will be very, very difficult to leave it. So one option could be, of course, to dismiss it, but this would be very costly. I see that is also in the interest of some other European state, which are part of the consortium or part of this of the contract. But we see that there is maybe a probability or maybe an opportunity that it will be built, but it will never deliver gas. So we will face federal elections in September, as you probably know. It could end up that we as the Greens will be part of this new coalition. And I do hope that we have strong voices in this, or might have strong voices in this new government, who will heavily lobby for any kind of a deal which will never allow any gas through this pipeline. But this is, of course, right now, speculation, hope, and maybe a good deal, but this could be one option.
Thank you. And now I invite Mr. Yatsenyuk to make his input into our discussion. Mr. Yatsenyuk, do you believe in liberal Russia? Do you believe in the democratic transformation of Russia?
Well, first of all, it's a great privilege to have Your Excellency, Mr. Kasparov, Ambassador McFaul, and member of the European Parliament, Madam Viola von Cramon, at the Kyiv Security Forum. We actually have today two events in the world, the Kyiv Security Forum and Munich Security Conference. Guess which one is more important? So here is my take. I want to share with you my take as a wartime prime minister. Putin's Russia is a belligerent state. And I'm going to present you a fact sheet or a kind of political indictment against Putin's regime. They invaded Ukraine. They illegally annexed Crimea. They invaded Georgia. They committed a number of political assassinations, like Mr. Nemtsov, like Politkovskaya. He made a number of attempted assassinations, like Mr. Navalny, like Mr. Skripal. He killed Mr. Litvinenko, suggestively. So they shot down MH17. And there is a huge network of Russian-made military guerrillas. They call it a private army, which is completely under the control of the Russian government. And they kill people all over the world. And this is not the complete list. So Russia and Putin's Russia is the real threat, in my opinion. And you asked me about the liberal Russia, whether it's possible to have liberal Russia. look, Putin and his allies, even in Europe, they invented a new definition of dictatorship, which is called sovereign democracy or illiberal democracy. And could you imagine that they say that they are the democratic state? For example, they say that they have the freedom of speech. And that's true. In Russia, they have a number of media outlets, TV channels, journalists. But 99% of the media coverage is completely controlled by Kremlin. The only media outlet, as far as I remember, they have this channel, Rain, Dosht, and that's it, period. They say that they have the freedom of religion. That's true. In Russia, there is a Russian Orthodox Church. They have priests. They have a number of congregations. But the problem is that the Russian Orthodox Church is a part of the Kremlin's dictatorship apparatus. And they even try to affect Ukraine via the Orthodox Church. They have the rule of law. And that's true. They have the Duma that rubber stamped a number of legislation. They have courts and even judges. But I can tell you from my experience, Russian courts issued an arrest warrant against me for killing 30 Russian soldiers in Chechnya. I never killed anybody. I never been to Chechnya. So this is the way they have these kind of attributes of democracy, but they don't have real democracy. Not to mention free and fair elections, which is the key pillar and the bedrock of any democracy. They have premeditated elections. So whether I believe that Russia could be liberal, I wish to have Russia as a normal democratic state. I wish to have Russia as a neighbor, as a cooperative neighbor. But it seems to me that this is a wishful thinking. Maybe the time will come and Russia will change. But it seems to me that a lot depends on us, I mean on the free world. First of all of us, we need to face up the real Russia. Appeasement doesn't work. That's not the language President Putin understands. All of us know the guy, okay? So he considers this kind of language as weakness. Another very important issue is that we as the free world have to be on the same page. His main goal is to split us. We need to have the one united flank against dictators like Putin. It has not to be any kind of daylight between the Western powers. The third issue is that the West, I mean Europe and Americans, they have to make very bold and strong actions. For example, to sanction an entire Putin's entourage. Look, they have billions of dollars allocated in Europe and in the United States. We have to stop this. This is the corrupted cash from cryptocratic government in Kremlin. The global community have to punish Putin and his machine for the crimes that they committed against the countries, against civilians, and the crimes that undermines the international order. And last but not least, it is important for the West to realize that you guys have to support countries like Ukraine. We are fighting for our democracy and we are fighting for your democracy, and we are fighting for our security and we are fighting for your security. And the best way to make the West, I mean the free world, stronger, and to make Ukraine, Georgia, and another country stronger, not just to bring perspective for EU and NATO membership, but to make Ukraine a NATO and EU members. This would be the best answer to kleptocratic and dictatorship government of President Putin. And this will make Russia better.
Thank you. My next question goes to Mr. Kasparov. Ambassador McFaul said this is a conflict between liberals and illiberals. Mr. Kasparov, there is a well-known saying that Russia's liberalism ends where the matters related to Ukraine start. Ukrainian philosopher Vladimir Yermolenko says that there is always a danger that Russian liberalism will sooner or later think about the strong hand, order, and finally, samodержавие. This conclusion shows the highest level of our mistrust. Your take. Does Russia's opposition need the support of Ukraine and the West? Can other Russia stand up not only against Putin's corruption, but for the freedom and democratic cohabitation with Ukraine, Belarus, and every other independent neighbor? Will other Russia respect the freedom of others, in your opinion? Thank you. You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. It's another existential question that has been dividing Russian opposition, not only people that are known as liberals. If you look at the so-called Russian nationalists, they're also divided in two categories. I would call one imperial nationalist, the Soviet nationalist, and one Russian nationalist. And the latter group, by the way, fully supports Ukrainian independence, Ukraine, in its legal territorial borders. And they also believe that, Russia may eventually join the European Union as the confederation of many Russian republics, and that there will not be crying over potential loss of some of the territories that are not coherent with Russian law and constitution, the way we hope it will be respected in the future. But when you look at the Russian liberals, I cannot argue, because many of my colleagues in the opposition movement expressed a strong support, or at least what they call middle position over annexation of Crimea or other aggressive actions of Putin regime. I belong to the group that believes that all the crimes of Putin regime, whether domestic or international, must be renounced by free Russian parliament in one shot, so in 30 seconds. Naturally, things like a return of Crimea to Ukraine may take the process could take, X amount of time. We don't know. It's, you have to maybe evacuate some people, bring others in. But I think that's the Russia, as I already said in my opening remarks, has no future unless it moves away from Russian empire. And that's, I think, was one of the fundamental problems that prevented Russia's transformation in the 90s. Because while other former Soviet republics, they turned, into national states, Russia still, contained the elements of empire. And it's the only way to move forward is to become a national state, in a good sense, national state, and leave the imperial virus behind us. Again, I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. Some people say it will never happen. But if Russia tries to stick to the imperial past, it will have no future. So I'm pushing this agenda, and I believe more and more people recognize that there's a embedded contradiction between demands for the triumph of rule of law in Russia, and at the same time pretending that some of the Russian international treaties may not be respected because we had historical records, historical justice. I think that's a very, very dangerous path, and I still believe that the simple recognition of the fact that Russia must respect its international obligations and must depart from its imperial past will prevail.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador McFaul, my next question goes to you. How do you see Ukraine's contribution into the international efforts aimed at facilitating other democratic Russia? How can we, the West and Ukraine, support the Belarus opposition and underpin the democratic processes in Moldova and Georgia? Don't you find that there is only one way to ensure long-lasting peace in our part of Europe and eventually in the whole of Europe? This is the full-fledged Euro-Atlantic integration of our nations and their membership in the European Union and NATO. You're welcome.
Well, big important questions you're asking. First, just to build on something that Garry Kasparov said, it's important to remember that Mr. Putin does not believe that Ukraine exists as an independent country. He believes that it's all part of one society, one civilization, one empire, as Gary said. My colleague here, Condoleezza Rice, a former Secretary of State here at Stanford, she writes in her book about democracy, a conversation she had with Mr. Putin precisely about this. She devotes a whole chapter of her book to this topic. By the way, another book that should be translated into many languages. And so those that don't believe that, I'm one of them, I think we all agree with that, have to demonstrate that that's not true. And as I've written many times, including the piece that you just decided, the most important mechanism for containing that ideology is successful liberal democracy in Ukraine. There's nothing more important to helping your liberals in Belarus or Russia or Moldova or anywhere else than to succeed in consolidating liberal democracy in Ukraine. And I want to be blunt. You're not doing a good enough job at that. We've had the Orange Revolution. We've had 2 revolutions now. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk was there, wartime prime minister. Consolidating those gains, I think, is vitally important. And you have not made enough progress, in my view. There's too much, the hopes that we had have been disappointed, in my view. There are too many liberal Democrats inside Ukraine who, if they were on this call right now, would be lamenting the lack of progress of consolidating liberal democracy inside Ukraine. Now, I push back on those arguments and I say Ukraine is in a horrible neighborhood. Ukraine is under war. Ukraine is occupied. It is difficult to consolidate liberal democracy under those conditions. We recently in the United States have been having a debate about the policy to ban those television stations in Ukraine. And small L liberals will say, well, that's not fair, that's not right. And I categorically disagree with that. When you are at war, you must take these kinds of efforts. And I defend those efforts. At the same time, political parties have not consolidated. Oligarchs, let's call them big business people, maybe they're your friends, but they have too much power over, they're blocking liberal democracy in my view. And so for me, the most important fight against Putin is to help consolidate liberal democracy in Ukraine. It should not just be up to Ukrainians alone, because it's our common struggle, I believe. But there's nothing more important. Everything else is much less important than that fight. And I think that is a fight that Washington, Brussels, Berlin needs to take much more seriously. What, practically speaking, can people that believe in democracy and believe in liberalism do to help consolidate liberal democracy? And what can liberal Democrats inside Ukraine do to fight harder for that consolidation? I think there's no other question that's more important in my view than that one.
Great points, and I fully support, including the part about the oligarchs and those who must become big businessmen, not the oligarchs. And I believe this message is very clear and should be sent to the Ukrainian authorities led by President Zelensky as well. So, and now I turn to Viola, and I cannot but mention the Kremlin's, Russia's war against Ukraine. What we see that the Kremlin is reluctant to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity. The peace process is stalled. It means that the Kremlin will further blackmail the West and Ukraine in order to gain political benefits, being sure that someday the West would inevitably get tired of yet another frozen conflict like in Georgia or Moldova. So there is a vital necessity to counter this strategy. And it can be achieved only through strong solidarity between the European Union and the United States, between the West and Ukraine. The Kyiv Security Forum recently suggested, and the Kyiv Security Forum believes that there is a need to have the summit of allies, the summit of the leaders of our nations, to elaborate a new roadmap to deter current and future offenses of President Putin. Would you agree with this idea? We need to reset our common pressure on Putin. How do you see the big security and political picture in our region? And what should we do about Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Georgia from the European perspective? You're welcome.
Thanks for this question as well. I think it's good to emphasize once again that with the new administration in the White House, it makes things much easier, because the last 4 years weren't really easy, especially when it came to Ukraine. Well, we all know that there wasn't really a will from Washington, so to say, to have an alliance against the Kremlin. And that communication was, of course, also be perceived in Kyiv. And with the first day in office, I would say, the Biden administration made clear that there will be a different direction. There will be a different form of cooperation, but also a tougher rhetoric. And closing the 3 channels, believe me, that was not the idea of Zelensky. That was mainly the pressure from Washington, and I could only congratulate for this, because it was overdue. So there are many, many other questions. And as Garry Kasparov has said, and also now with the COVID, this COVID hybrid war is going on in the occupied territories. I mean, not the Russians, but the Kremlin, the authorities come into the occupied territories and say, hey, here's some vaccination. Well, you know, this is just a dozen or some hundreds, but not really an amount of doses where you can have protection for people. But nevertheless, it's of course used to undermine our anti-vaccination strategy. So I fully share we need more hard security and also maybe a direct offer for NATO membership for sure. But on the other hand, we have to include Ukraine much more into this soft power strategies. So we have to make sure they get the first vaccination, not from Russia, or not from China, not from any other, I don't know, deliveries, but from the European Union at the same moment when actually all the other member states have access. And that hasn't happened so far. And of course, this is easy then for the Kremlin to say, hey, where are your Westerners? Where are your alliance? Where's Washington? Where's Brussels when you need them? So this would be one thing. And on the other hand, you said the reset button, or like to counter this. I mean, in terms of Belarus, this is really a tough fight. I think in Ukraine, it's a little bit more easy to make sure we will not give up on the occupied territories, while I guess the majority of Ukrainians have a clear perspective. They want to stay on the pro-Western direction, and they have made their decision already in 2013. In Belarus, for example, we see this movement going on since the fraudulent election on the 9th of August. But nevertheless, the influence of the Kremlin is so significant that it will be very, very difficult to get Belarus out of this sphere of influence. And so that needs, I think, an adapted strategy. You cannot compare Belarus and you cannot compare the situation in Georgia, which is also crazy now. And where you, Ambassador, are absolutely right. We should try to consolidate the gains instead of doing 2, 3, 4 steps backwards, what we see in Georgia now. I mean, this is really a domestic crisis which started to show up yesterday, or to begin yesterday. And so I think what we need is more attention. We need, as I said before, we need more special envoys. We need more personal relation. We need a shuttle diplomacy. We need committed people on the ground. Cooperation is in terms of COVID has not really come to this point where Ukrainians see, okay, This comes from the European Union, this comes from Washington, this comes from Canada, but so far there's no vaccination. And so these things, I guess we can be much better than in the last weeks. But on the other hand, I would say rhetoric, a clear setup of an agenda, and hopefully an alliance within the European Union member states would also be helpful. And there we have, let's say, a growing reluctance, not just Orban, but also some others, to have a tough stand on the Kremlin or on Putin.
Thank you. And by the way, I just would like to use this opportunity to invite you, our partners and friends all over the world, to support the recent initiatives of the Ukrainian government, including the initiative of having the Crimean platform, which means to gather people all over the globe, to gather the governments to get back to yet another vital issue for Ukraine's and European security, how to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea and the occupied Donbas. Viola, thank you very much for your remarks from the European perspective. So now I invite Mr. Yatsenyuk to make his concluding remarks for this important debate, which I believe is the beginning, not the end of our conversation. You're welcome.
Well, first of all, I'm not here to criticize the Ukrainian government. And Ambassador McFaul, you're absolutely right that we can achieve more. We try. I believe that the new president, well, he is actually not the new one, but the president of Ukraine and the incumbent government, they are to realize their responsibility. They are to realize that it's up to them to change Ukraine, to make Ukraine closer to the European Union, to make Ukraine a part of the free world. And we have this chance, and we have even another window of opportunity with the new US administration. President Biden is a student of Ukraine, and the entire apparatus of the United States, I mean, political establishment of the United States, sitting in the Department of States or in the House or in the Senate, as we have the bipartisan approach, support in the US, they do understand what Ukraine is really about. I strongly believe that we have a very close links with our European friends. And we managed, for example, to deliver an amazing achievement to the Ukrainian people, which is the visa-free regime. This is the real freedom of movement. This is the real feeling of the Ukrainian people that we are really the part of this free world, that we can easily enter to the European Union. So if we want, we can make. And this is to be a win-win situation, both for the United States and for the European Union and for Ukraine. Look, compare Ukraine with another so-called post-Soviet countries, except Baltic states, because Baltic states are doing much better because they are the part of the European Union. Ukraine is a stronghold of democracy in the Eastern Europe after the Soviets collapsed. We do understand that we have our failures, but what we understand that we have Ukrainian national dignity. We showed it during the Revolution of Dignity. We know how to fight for the freedom and for our sovereignty. And we know that you are our closest allies. And if we are together, we can change this world. If we are successful, if we are strong, we can even try at least to change this belligerent state, I mean Russia, Putin's Russia, into more or less normal cooperative country, which is not to threaten neighbors, but at least which is to cohabitate with neighbors.
Ambassador McFaul, would you like to react to what Prime Minister Yatsenyuk says?
I completely agree. I think Democrats of the world need to unite against the autocrats of the world. I do think it's an ideological struggle. And I think, the front line of that battle right now is in Ukraine. And I want to emphasize, as somebody who's written about democracy globally, not just in Europe, and over centuries, not just in the last 10 years, that I actually do believe that the most important fight in the world for the advance of liberalism and the advance of democracy right now is in Ukraine. Our friend Gary Kasparov and I, Gary knew him much better than I did, but Boris Nemtsov used to always say, if you want to help liberals and Democrats in Russia consolidate democracy, let democracy, help democracy in Ukraine win. Because that, more than any other fact, will destroy Putin's myth about imperial Russia. It will destroy his myth that people in that part of the world love the strong leader and dictatorship. There's nothing more important than destroying that ideology of Putinism than a democratic Ukraine.
Thank you, Ambassador McFaul. Mr. Kasparov, will you agree with what Ambassador McFaul said?
Wholeheartedly. So we all know that success of Ukraine will be a deadly blow to the imperial phantasms of Putin's Russia. It says to prove that Ukraine, the state that is very close to Russia, could succeed by being democratic, by being liberal, by being free, will send a message to people of Russia that this is the way for our country. This is the path into the future. And we should throw away the imperial past to embrace our European future. And again, I have been saying it all along, that regimes like Putin's collapse after being defeated geopolitically. And no one can imagine a more of a final geopolitical defeat that for Putin's Russia to be thrown away from Ukraine, for Ukraine to restore its territorial integrity, and to become a success story that will illuminate the old failures and old crimes of Putin's Russia.
I thank you.
Intervene.
Yes, you're welcome.
Mr. Kasparov, you know, I do remember the times in Ukraine when at that time President Yanukovych was in power. And a majority of Ukrainians believed that Yanukovych would be forever. It didn't happen. He fled the country and he is right now in Moscow. A lot of people believe that the Berlin Wall will always exist, or that the Baltic states will be always the part of the Soviet Union. It didn't happen. They are free and there is no longer Berlin Wall. The reason why I'm telling you this, it's so important for us to have one strong, united opposition in Russia. Never give up. You have an amazing news, you have an amazing people, and they believe in you. They believe in democracy. They believe in the wind of changes. Like Ukrainians believed in the wind of changes that we presented as an opposition. So fight for your country, and you're gonna win this fight.
I thank you. I like this discussion. Many people say that Putin will not rule Russia forever, and it's true. But the history of Ukraine clearly proves that a simple change of one authoritarian ruler in Russia does not mean a real transformation. In my opinion, in the opinion of many my friends and colleagues here in Ukraine, Russia's better future requires deeper fundamental changes to deny and abandon the ideology of imperialism, to respect the national dignity and sovereignty of other nations, to respect and to establish the dignity and human rights of the Russian people. These simple rules are the only way to heal deep diseases of Putin's Russia. This is the only way, in my opinion, in our opinion, to build a new and healthy Russia, the other Russia. I thank you very much for this important and timely debate. I thank you, Mr. Kasparov. I thank you, Ambassador McFaul. I thank you, Mrs. Viola von Cramon, for giving your important perspectives and contributions. Дуже дякую за увагу. Це був Київський безпековий форум. Дякую.